That is a key question. What makes this uprising different than others? I would say two things. One is this uprising has really shown the resiliency and the continued growth of the pro-democracy movement in Iran. Because in the previous uprising, some could actually sit back and say, well, people are getting into the street and protesting over economic grievances. But, economic grievances will not bring this regime down. But this uprising started with the political grievances. Although in every uprisings, nationwide uprisings, whether it was this decade or the previous decades, the cornerstone and the message and the slogan that came from those movements has always been down with the dictators. This uprising in particular, it says death to Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. And then the other critical message that comes from this uprising is the fact that women are leading this uprising, because they're the ones that are paying the heaviest price. Women are the agent of change in Iran. And in fact, they have the most to gain by bringing this regime down. So it is the women and youth that are leading this movement, and they actually have been able to shift the fear from the general public and putting that fear in the Iranian regime. There's not a day that goes by that we hear the officials of the Iranian government to say the ship is sinking. If this ship goes down, we're all going to go down together.
That's right.
And I think that really speaks to the point that the Iranian people have successfully weakened this regime through the resilient movement for democracy in the last 4 decades. And now we're seeing the culmination of all that coming to this enduring 6 months of protests that has not stopped, and it continues to happen in a different form than what we've seen before.
And let's talk about maybe from Washington's perspective, right? Do you feel as though there's a change in our policymakers, in our leaders in terms of how they view the situation, or maybe putting more support behind the Iranian people than ever before?
Sure. I think to some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. Let's just start with the positive side. I think there is a consensus that this regime is now a threat to humanity far beyond Iran's borders.
That's right.
The question is, what do you do about that threat, and how you mitigate that threat? And some continue to believe, as Ramesh mentioned earlier, that we do that through engagement with this regime and trying to convince its advancement, i.e. the nuclear issue, and leave alone other threats from the regime. We have contended, and many in Congress, including the more than 225 members who have co-sponsored House Resolution 100, we contend that the threat from the regime is not primarily on the nuclear issue, whereas in fact that is a threat. That is why the MEK and the Iranian resistance divulged Iran's nuclear weapons program decades ago. But the threat comes from its inability to address the Iranian people's desire for change, for democracy, for voice, for all of humanity within the borders of Iran, and certainly adjusting to the desires of the peoples of the global community, and so able to be dynamic in that sense. So this regime, therefore, is fundamentalist. It is regressive, and it is therefore oppressive to maintain that regressive environment. So now we are at the point where the international community, in some sense, is trying to do both. It's trying to, on the one hand, pressure the regime and keep it under check. On the other hand, also reach out to the regime, allow its ambassadors and diplomats to roam around Europe so that there is a veneer of normalcy and diplomacy relative to Iran. All the while, though, the regime continues the advancement of its own mission relative to the nuclear weapons program, relative to deteriorating human rights conditions inside Iran, and of course, expansion of terrorism networks across the globe. And those are not separate. In other words, regardless of whether you do diplomacy with Iran or not, whether you have a JCPOA or not, the regime will continue to advance its nuclear weapons program. It will continue to be more predatory on the other aspects of its being, because in itself, it is an scorpion. It is what it is designed to do. And what the international community is doing is literally putting a veneer on this and feeling okay about it. Well, the sacrifice, unfortunately, the price is being paid by the people on the ground, in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, and across the globe. So we need to change that paradigm. And I think in the United States Congress, there is a significant consensus that the United States policy should be pivoting from trying to engage the regime in perpetuity, but rather align itself with the wishes and the desires of the people of Iran, which essentially says regime change.
Yeah.
Democratic regime change by the people of Iran, and we might add, organized resistance. And there is a reason why we say that. In order to bring about any meaningful change, whether it be in an organization that is minute or a large organization or a country or a city, you will need, first and foremost, a capable organization, that it has capabilities, that it has a leadership, and I might add also a plan as to what that change ultimately will look like. And it is in that context you'll see both myself and Ramesh and others in our community have said, we as a community support the National Council of Resistance of Iran. We did that after considerable deliberation as to finding within Iran, not outside of Iran, not fly-by oppositions, but rather within Iran, who has since 1982 created an infrastructure, has had a significant stable leadership, and has had a plan that outlines a Jeffersonian framework for a future Iran, for a temporary transitional government inside Iran, where the people and their voice can reign supreme. And so, yes, I think the United States policy is pivoting that way, but we hope that it does sooner, because the longer it takes, the more difficult, the more pricey, and the more kids, unfortunately, will die suffocating by the gases of the regime, whether it be in Syria, where they used it during the Syrian conflict, whether it is in the streets of Tehran or across Iran.
Across
That's
Iran,
right.
as we see today.